It was late afternoon, and I was tidying up my bedroom when the sound of the door creaking behind me made me freeze. I spun around and there he was, Nolan, standing in the doorway, staring directly at the thing I was holding. My stomach dropped. How was I supposed to explain this? The object in my hand wasn't exactly innocent. Brightly colored, large, and definitely not something you could brush off with casual small talk. I'd only pulled it out to dust behind the cabinet, not thinking anyone would walk in. I was certain I'd locked the door. Apparently not. Nolan, my 23-year-old stepson, wasn't supposed to be home this early. He worked at a brewery downtown and usually stayed out late with friends after his shift. But here he was, tall and lean, his messy dark hair framing those annoyingly sharp blue eyes that now danced with amusement. "What's that?" he asked, his voice teetering between curious and teasing. I felt my face catch fire as I dropped the item like it had burned me. Grabbing the nearest thing within reach, a throw pillow from the bed, I clutched it to my chest, desperate to cover my mistake. "It's none of your business," I stammered, my throat tightening with every word. But his expression didn't shift. If anything, the smirk on his face deepened as he leaned casually against the doorframe, clearly enjoying the show. "You don't need to be so embarrassed," he said, his tone low and maddeningly nonchalant. "It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. The audacity of this kid, well, not really a kid, more of a grown man, to stand there acting like this was just another normal moment while my world spun off its axis. Forcing out a laugh that sounded as shaky as I felt, I waved him off. "Nolan, seriously, just go. This isn't your space, and you shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't budge. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until I realized he wasn't even looking at the pillow anymore. His gaze was fixed on me, sharp and searching, like he'd suddenly seen a version of me he hadn't known existed. I felt an unwelcome flicker of heat deep in my chest, followed almost instantly by an overwhelming wave of guilt. This wasn't right, whatever this was. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. Married to his father. Shaking my head, I broke the tension as best I could. "Please, Nolan. Just go." Finally he shrugged, lifting his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, his voice light and easy again. But as he turned to leave, he gave me one last look. It wasn't the smirk that lingered this time. It was something else, something that rattled me to my core. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the pillow against me like a shield. My heart was racing, and the thought of putting the item back in the drawer felt impossible. The air between us had shifted in some intangible way, and I knew I wouldn't see Nolan the same way again. For the rest of the evening I tried to shake it off. I cooked dinner, folded the laundry, and even sat beside Victor on the couch while he flipped through his beloved westerns. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape Nolan's face, his smirk, or the unsettling way his eyes had lingered on me. Victor, oblivious as ever, didn't notice my distraction. He hadn't been particularly tuned in for years, too busy with his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, since retiring. I didn't hold it against him. Resentment would have been too easy. But more often than not, I felt like a live-in caretaker rather than a wife. At one point I glanced down the hallway and saw Nolan's shadow moving behind the door to his room. The faint hum of bass-heavy music slipped into the otherwise quiet house. My pulse quickened for reasons I couldn't explain, and I quickly turned back to Victor, who was already dozing in his recliner, head tilted down, soft snores filling the air. The TV droned on in the background, but I didn't bother waking him. What was the point? Instead, I wandered into the kitchen, hoping to find some peace. But the solitude didn't last long. Nolan entered moments later, his bare feet soft against the hardwood floor. He wore a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair a tousled mess like he'd just dragged his hands through it. "Hey," he said, casually grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "You're up late." I shrugged, forcing a light tone. "I could say the same about you." He leaned against the counter, smiling faintly. "Just unwinding. It's not exactly easy living under this roof sometimes." That comment made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged again. But this time there was a seriousness in his expression that caught me off guard. It's nothing. Just being here again. Feels like I don't fit anymore. Despite everything, the maternal part of me softened. It's only temporary, I said, keeping my voice calm. You'll figure it out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet. His gaze softened and his voice dropped as he murmured, "Thanks, Meredith. I appreciate that." The way he said my name low and quiet unsettled me. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with something unspoken. His eyes lingered, and I felt that same warmth stirring in my chest. Clearing my throat, I turned away, busying myself by wiping the counter. I needed to snap out of it, whatever it was. But Nolan wasn't ready to let it go. "About earlier," he began, his tone slipping back into that maddeningly playful lilt. "You really don't have to be embarrassed, you know? I mean, we're all human, right?" I froze mid-wipe, my hand gripping the cloth a little tighter than necessary. Turning toward him, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Nolan, let's just drop it, okay? It was nothing, an accident. Not worth bringing up again." "Okay," he said, raising his hands like he was surrendering. But the teasing glint in his eyes and the smirk on his lips sent my stomach into a tailspin. He walked past me, so close that the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something spicy, lingered in the air between us. I didn't turn around, but I felt his presence, heavy and lingering, before he finally exited the kitchen. That night, lying next to Victor in bed, my thoughts spun out of control. What was happening to me? To this house? To us? I'd always prided myself on keeping boundaries, firm lines that weren't meant to blur, let alone disappear. But Nolan had a way of bending those lines with alarming ease, even when he wasn't trying. And the most unsettling part? I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning I tried to shove it all aside and pretend everything was normal. Like always, I made breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor and a smoothie for myself. Nolan was the last to shuffle into the kitchen, his damp hair suggesting he'd just stepped out of the shower. He greeted Victor with a casual "morning," and then turned to me with a smile that sent my pulse skittering. The three of us sat at the table, the usual clinks of silverware and light conversation filling the air. But underneath the mundane routine, I could feel the tension simmering thick and undeniable. Every time Nolan's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled the coffee pot, it felt deliberate. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady, unreadable, and far too intense. Victor, of course, noticed none of it. He was too focused on buttering his toast and flipping through the morning paper. After breakfast, Nolan did something unexpected. "I'll help you clean up," he offered. Normally, he would have vanished into his room or headed out to meet friends, so I blinked at him, momentarily caught off guard. "You don't have to," I said, stacking plates in the sink. "I want to," he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. We worked side by side in silence, but the air between us felt charged, like the quiet held more weight than words ever could. At one point we both reached for the same glass, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled away right away. "You're different," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" I managed, my voice strained. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the right words. "I don't know, you're just not like other women your age." I laughed nervously, stepping back to create some distance between us. "Well, that's flattering, I guess." "It's not just that," he continued, his tone serious now, almost vulnerable. "You're real. You actually listen to people. You see them." His sincerity caught me off guard, leaving me at a loss for words. I turned back to the sink, focusing on the dishes as though they were the most important task in the world. But I could feel him behind me, close enough that his presence was almost tangible. My heart raced again, betraying me in a way I hated. Before I could pull my thoughts together, Victor's voice carried in from the living room. "Meredith, where's my crossword book?" The spell broke and Nolan stepped back, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "I'll let you get back to him," he said lightly before walking away. I let out a shaky breath, relief and something far more dangerous swirling inside me. I knew I was treading on thin ice, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from inching closer to the heat. That afternoon I buried myself in errands, anything to keep my mind busy and away from Nolan. But when I returned home, I found him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard like he was lost in thought. "Hey," I said softly as I approached, unsure why I felt so drawn to him. He glanced up at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, everything okay?" I nodded, but something in his expression made me pause. "What about you?" He hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the yard. "Yeah, just thinking. About life, I guess," he said after a beat. "Where I'm going. Where I should be going." I sat down beside him, leaving a respectful amount of space between us but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "You're young, Nolan. You don't have to have it all figured out yet." "Maybe," he said, his voice quiet. Then after a pause he added, "Do you ever feel like you're stuck in the wrong story? Like you were meant for something else?" His words struck a nerve I didn't want to acknowledge. I forced a smile. "Sometimes. But you learn to make the best of the story you're in." He didn't reply right away, and we sat there in silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between us. I wanted to comfort Nolan, to say something reassuring like, "It's all going to work out," but I couldn't bring myself to lie, not when I didn't believe it myself. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You're not trapped," I said, hoping he didn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment he placed his hand over mine. The gesture felt impossibly intimate, and I pulled away quickly, but the damage was already done. Another line blurred, another boundary crossed, and each time it seemed harder and harder to pretend it hadn't happened. That evening a storm rolled in, casting the sky in shades of slate gray. The air was heavy, almost electric, like the world was bracing for something inevitable. Victor went to bed early. He'd complained of a sore shoulder all day, and I found myself alone in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading. The storm outside mirrored the one building inside me. Restless, volatile, and impossible to ignore. From the kitchen, I could hear Nolan moving around. The sound of the fridge door opening and closing, followed by the faint clink of glass, carried through the quiet house. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses. "Whiskey?" he asked, his brow raised. "I don't usually drink this late," I replied, caught off guard. "Maybe tonight's an exception." Without waiting for an answer, he handed me one of the glasses. I hesitated but took it. The cool glass felt oddly grounding in my palm. Nolan sank into the armchair across from me, stretching out his legs in that casual way he had. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow over his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I said, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting." He smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a small sip of the whiskey. It burned as it went down, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension coiled inside me. For a while we sat in silence, the storm outside growing louder with each passing moment. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him, wary. "Depends." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring at it as if searching for answers. "Do you ever feel stuck?" The question hit me harder than I cared to admit. It echoed the one he'd asked earlier, but now there was a deeper weight to it. "Sometimes," I said, barely above a whisper. He looked up then, his gaze locking onto mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." His words were like a spark to dry kindling. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and quickly looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Nolan, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "It's true." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with everything we weren't saying. I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us. "I think it's time to call it a night," I said, my voice tight. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I froze mid-step. "Oh," I muttered, my voice shaky. It's just the storm, Nolan said, his voice calm, steady. I heard him stand, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. Hold on, I'll find a flashlight. As he moved closer, his hand brushed mine in the dark. I sucked in a sharp breath. Sorry, he murmured, but his hand didn't pull away. It lingered, warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Meredith, he whispered, his voice impossibly close. I turned toward him instinctively, even though I couldn't see him in the pitch black. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, the steady rhythm of his breath. Then his hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. This is a bad idea, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he replied. But he didn't let go. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a brief moment. In that flicker of light I saw his face. Earnest, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly close. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though he was giving me a chance to stop him. But I didn't. I leaned into him instead, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth. When the lights flickered back on, we pulled apart. The reality of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave, and I stumbled back, my hands trembling. This can't happen, I said, shaking my head. Nolan didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. I know, he said, his voice steady. But it already has. The next few days were a blur of avoidance and denial. I threw myself into chores, errands, and anything else that would keep me from being alone with my thoughts, or with him. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't erase the memory of his lips on mine or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Nolan appeared in the doorway. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. There's nothing to talk about. Yes, there is, he countered, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting down the laundry and meeting his gaze. Nolan, this, whatever this is, has to stop. It's wrong. Is it? He asked, his tone calm but challenging. Because it doesn't feel wrong to me. Nolan's words sent a shiver down my spine, though I fought to keep my expression calm. You don't understand, I said, my voice edged with tension. If Victor ever found out. He won't, Nolan interrupted firmly. And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore. The sting of his words was sharp because they struck too close to the truth. Victor's indifference had become a quiet, constant ache, but that didn't make Nolan's statement any less cutting, or any more excusable. This isn't about him, I snapped, my voice rising. It's about us. About the fact that this, whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible. Nolan took a step closer, his gaze locked on mine, unyielding. Why? Because you're afraid of what people might think? Or is it because you're afraid of what you might think? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Melanie, he said softly, the intensity in his voice giving way to something gentler. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, blinking furiously. You don't understand, I whispered. Then explain it to me, he said, his voice low and pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't put into words the storm inside me. The guilt, the longing, the fear of where this road might lead. So I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night sleep was a distant dream. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Victor's steady breathing beside me, the only sound in the quiet room. My mind was a tangle of emotions I couldn't unravel, a whirlwind I couldn't escape. At some point I slipped out of bed and into the hallway, hoping a glass of water would help calm my restless thoughts. But as I neared the kitchen I froze. Nolan's door was open, and he stood there in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame as if he'd been waiting. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice soft but steady. I shook my head, unable to speak. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken words. Then, without another glance, I turned and walked back to my room, shutting the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this dangerous, impossible thing between us, it wasn't going away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there was no storm to blame, no flickering lights to shield us. This time it was deliberate. It started in the laundry room of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer, letting the mundane task soothe my restless mind. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I was alone. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "You're always working," Nolan said, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But don't you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" "Taking care of everything. Taking care of everyone. When's the last time someone took care of you?" The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I turned, clutching a folded towel to my chest like a shield. "Nolan, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Why not?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, searching, and impossibly focused on me. "Because," I said, my voice faltering, "it's not appropriate." "Appropriate," he repeated, rolling the word over his tongue like it was foreign. "That's not the same as honest, though, is it?" I wanted to argue, to shut him down before he could say anything else that might push me further into this mess. But before I could, he stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking with every step. "You don't have to pretend with me, Melanie," he said softly. "I see you. I see the way you keep everything together while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself?" My throat tightened and I shook my head, stepping back until the counter pressed against my hips. "Nolan, whatever this is, it has to stop." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he whispered. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't, because it would have been a lie. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. This time I didn't stop him. The days that followed blurred together. Stolen moments, whispered conversations, and a growing sense of unease. We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Nolan found excuses to linger in the same room as me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a cabinet door, volunteering to run errands. At first, the secrecy was thrilling, but the weight of it all was suffocating. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Bethany, our nosy neighbor, waved at me, I felt like she could see through me. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Nolan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing toward the doorway. "Nolan," I hissed, trying to pull away. "Victor could walk in any minute." "He's at the hardware store," Nolan said, his tone calm. "Relax." But I couldn't. The paranoia was eating me alive. "We need to talk," I said, turning to face him. "About what?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Us." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw something dark flicker in his eyes. "What about us?" "This has to stop," I said, forcing the words out even though they felt heavy on my tongue. "It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor." "Fair to Victor?" Nolan repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself, Melanie? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want." "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped, frustration and guilt bubbling to the surface. "That's bull," Nolan shot back, his eyes blazing. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you." His words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't shake. He wasn't wrong, deep down I knew that. But admitting it, even to myself, felt like crossing an invisible line I couldn't uncross. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Victor had invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner, and I found myself playing the role of the perfect hostess, smiling through the tension that churned in my chest. But Bethany's sharp eyes seemed glued to me all evening, her expression unreadable but somehow probing. After dinner, as I was tidying up in the kitchen, she cornered me. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said, her voice casual but her eyes cutting through me. "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile that felt paper-thin. "You know how it is." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Does Victor know?" My heart dropped into my stomach, the blood rushing in my ears. "No," I managed, the word barely audible. She shrugged, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Whatever's going on with you and Nolan?" She let the words hang, their weight suffocating. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice unsteady. Bethany's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Just be careful, Melanie. Secrets have a way of coming out." That night I couldn't stop replaying her words. They echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing moment. I felt trapped, caught in a web of my own making. The next morning, Nolan found me in the garden, yanking weeds from the soil with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I snapped, standing and brushing dirt from my hands. "Bethany knows, Nolan. She knows." His expression darkened. "How could she know?" "I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Victor?" "She won't," he interrupted, his tone firm. "You don't know that." I shot back, the fear in my chest turning to anger. "You don't understand how dangerous this is." Nolan grabbed my hand, his grip strong but gentle. "What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "But we have to be careful, for both our sakes." The days that followed were tense. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least not that I knew of, but her lingering suspicion hung over me like a storm cloud. Nolan tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge. Then, one evening, the inevitable happened. Victor came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Nolan, the two of us standing far closer than we should have been. When we heard the front door open, we sprang apart, the sudden movement as guilty as the act itself. "Melanie," Victor called, his voice carrying through the house. "In here," I replied, struggling to keep my tone steady. Victor appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room. For a moment he said nothing, but his gaze lingered just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Dinner ready?" he asked, his tone unreadable. "Almost," I replied quickly. He left without another word, but the way his eyes had locked onto mine stayed with me long after he was gone. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of that moment playing over and over in my mind. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground beneath me to crumble. The storm broke the next day. Victor came home earlier than usual again, but this time his expression was different, tighter, sharper, like he was holding something back. He set his briefcase down with a deliberate thud, the sound reverberating through the house. "Nolan," he called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach twist. Nolan appeared moments later, his casual demeanor at odds with the tension crackling in the air. "Yeah?" Nolan asked, his tone calm but wary. "I need to talk to you," Victor said, his eyes locked on Nolan. I froze, my breath catching as the space between the three of us seemed to shrink. "Sure," Nolan said, though his gaze flicked toward me, a silent question in his eyes. Victor didn't say anything else. He turned and walked down the hallway, Nolan following him. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear anything. Raised voices, muffled words, but the house remained eerily quiet. When Victor finally returned, his face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something I couldn't quite place. "You and Nolan," he said, his voice low, each word heavy with unspoken meaning. "I know,"